So today, as Mark said, we're going to talk a little bit about our experience this past year and sort of filling gaps in technology in the security space. So as sort of a level set, if people aren't familiar with the national labs or Oak Ridge National Lab, a lot of the national labs, the complex got its start in the Manhattan Project. At this point, they all still fall under DOE, but we do a wide variety of things. So one of the things Oak Ridge is often known for is supercomputing. We have several other major missions as well. But you'll see that all of those revolve around technology and science. And that's really true across all of the labs. And this is sometimes, I think, how we believe things happen, right? I do research and then everyone is more secure. The world is saved. That's great. In reality, there is this middle step, right? Like there are a lot of things between the research that I'm doing day to day and an end user actually improving their security. One of those things is user input. So understanding who is the customer, which of course everyone who on here who owns a business has probably thought about this, but it doesn't often come up in research because our customer tends to be the government. And so we aren't necessarily talking to the grid operators when we're doing all of our research. And this is across the board, but today I'm going to talk mostly about grid because that's what we've been working on. Another is workforce. That's both our workforce, which we do obviously think about, and then also workforce for the end user, right? Are they going to be able to use this tool? Do they have the people with the right skill sets? The best tool, if they don't have someone to use it, is not going to be very helpful. So what does that look like? The transition partners. How do we get our research into a form that can actually be deployed? Most of what we do is very proof of concept, low TRL research. And so it needs someone who can take it and support it and move it to the next level. And then the last one, I'm sure there are others, but the last one that we focused on is this realistic test and evaluation environment. And this is really broad as far as we are looking at how do we do research in a place that if we have an end user come in, they recognize themselves in that environment. A lot of times we tend to put things in racks. We do small scale testing on that. And then when you try and show someone, they say, well, that doesn't look like my environment. This won't work because X, Y, Z. So between having the right environments and getting that user input early on, the hope is we can eliminate some of that after the fact realization. And the solution that we've started to develop to this problem is what we call the Southeast Region Cybersecurity Collaboration Center. And broadly, our goal is to improve operational technology cybersecurity in the energy sector. So most of our work this year, this is the first year that we've been doing this, has been specifically on utilities, electric utilities in the region. And we've established sort of four main objectives to reach this overall objective. And the first one is establishing these regional industry partnerships. So the program itself is a partnership between Oak Ridge and the McCrary Institute. And we've been joined by Scott Madden, who helps keep us all in order, and who's also to thank for many of the slides. And then on top of that, we have 5 different utilities that we've asked to be part of our industry advisory board. And so their role is to help direct the center as far as what types of things we should address. But it's also a way for us to get buy-in and to get assistance with what we call our technical working group, which are the people who are doing this day to day, who are setting up these systems. The folks on our industry advisory board are generally CISO level or higher. And But they can identify the right people and have the resources to say, yes, please support this. And Southern has been a huge one for us because one of our leads for this program has been an assignee essentially from Southern for the past year. So that has been huge in getting input from all 5 of these companies. And we selected them, one, because they're in our region, but also because they're a broad swath of the types of utilities, right? So EPB being municipal, Southern being investor owned, Power South is a co-op. They also cover everything from generation to distribution. So on top of that, we also have our ecosystem partners, and there are a number of them, and that's growing since we're still building out our ecosystem. But that was one of the first things that we did. So to my earlier point about we need realistic environments, this is what we've been putting together. And obviously this is a low detail version of it. But we've tried to make a couple of different types of environments where researchers can operate, where students can operate, where we can do tool testing, etc. And as you can see, we've covered a variety of different energy assets, and we're working with both the utilities to get realistic architectures, and then also with those solution providers and OEMs to make sure that we have equipment that looks like what would be seen in the field. One of our big lessons learned, I think, from watching other programs is this constant engagement with industry. So I think a lot of times it's we talk to them at the beginning, they said, yep, that seems like a good idea, and then we go forth and do. And so what we've been trying to do here is to keep these regular touch points. And the idea there is to make sure that as we are making assumptions, they keep us on track if we sort of go off. So a big piece of having James Gooseby is my colleague that is at Auburn in the group has been that he can help us a lot with that industry perspective on a regular basis because that's the world that he comes from. But also we want to consistently check in with our technical working group and our IAB. So one example of that has been determining, one of the things we've worked on is determining what are the R&D priorities that we should focus on based on the challenges that industry is facing. So I say why technology is not enough, but at the end of the day, I do still work somewhere that values technology and development of technology and science. So one of the things we want to do is to make that technology and science more relevant. And so what we did was we hosted a series of workshops with our industry partners. And one of the things we heard from them in those workshops was that it was helpful for them just to talk to other industry folks. And so they would say, like, we'd get a couple of them together to kind of talk about things. They'd be like, oh, I didn't realize you had that same solution, or here's what we had done. And there are obviously groups in industry that do this already. It's not like nobody talks, but there's obviously still some gaps. And so that was interesting in and of itself. But then, of course, we also got the insights from them. We took those insights and we evaluated them against sort of existing cybersecurity frameworks so that we could try, we left it very open-ended, right? As far as what are your biggest challenges in the space? And so then we said, okay, well, how do we make these into some sort of grouping so that we can get additional information? We did that. We used the NIST CSF, and then we went back to them and did deep dives. We highlighted, these are sort of the top things. Let's go through each of those and say, how does this piece, what are the specific challenges in this area for you? We took that and again, had to boil all of that down. And then we said, okay, based on that, here are these priorities and what we think would be good R&D projects to try and address them. And we took those back to our technical working group and IAB to say, largely, did we interpret this correctly? And so that really leads to this facilitate development of OT solutions, right? I talked about this a little bit of we want to build better things, do better research, things that can be applied. There will always be a place where we're doing things that are perhaps beyond what the current applications of industry are, but we'd still like to make sure as much as possible that these align. And so these are the challenges that we talked about and identified as sort of the top high-level challenges. So we have a lot more information, but for the purposes here, third-party risk, security and event monitoring, and cloud security were big ones. And part of that is, I think, probably communication-based, right? Understanding what's out there. Part of it is the IT-OT gap. When some of these folks talk to solutions providers and they don't know what OT is, then, which is operational technology, so everyone on the call can say that, then that's like an automatic, nope, you don't understand my world, and that's probably not a tool they're interested in. And so, so moving sort of forward on that, we looked at these 4 strategic focus areas for research in the future. One of those is developing frameworks for tailoring and communicating about those IT cyber tools in OT environments. Because from talking to the practitioners and then what we kind of knew internally as a team, we thought there are potentially tools that already exist that do some of these things that they are wrestling with. And frankly, even their internal teams may use them, but those teams aren't talking. So how do we help make this sort of a shared language? How do we help people communicate better what their tools do, or to even change their tools if there really are differences for the OT environment? A second is evaluating, improving alerting. So there obviously is a lot of things already in the security and event monitoring space. There are lots of solutions. And the lab's role here, and the university as well, is really not to compete with industry. We're not allowed to. So the question here for us is, okay, what is missing, right? And this is something that we think needs additional research of sitting with the utility and saying, okay, what are you not getting? Let's deploy tools in a realistic environment and see what's the type of information we get. Again, is this something where there's just not clear guidance on how they should set up their tools? Is this that they aren't using the right tools? Or is it that the tools are missing something? So sort of doing that as an initial piece. And then if there's room to improve the alerting, looking at some of the technologies to do that. Sort of the follow-on to that is performing validation of the OT cybersecurity controls and doing cybersecurity response activities. So what happens on a bad day, right? And this is something that, especially for utilities that are SIP regulated, they are going to have these plans, but not necessarily in the regulation as it currently is written do they have to know that they're going to work, right? But I think ideally you would like to know that they're going to work before you need them. So having people practice them is the best way to do that. And so we've been looking at how do we, basically work with people through adversary emulation type techniques in this space to say, okay, I have confidence that my controls work. I have confidence that my responses are going to be what they should be, and that reduces my risk, right, as an organization. And then the last one is cloud security, and that one's been tricky because it's very split. Folks that don't fall under SIP are more willing, and in many cases already, using cloud tools or cloud-based tools. And so they're like, yeah, I don't understand. We get it. We know how to do this. It's not a problem. A lot of the other folks in generation and transmission, what we heard was from the people on the ground, we heard no way, no how, we're never going to the cloud. And from folks, you know, a little higher in the organization, we would hear, well, eventually the cloud is coming and we're worried that we're not ready because right now we can't and we have that excuse. But one day that won't be an excuse and then we'll be trying to do this and we'll be behind. So a lot of the question there is around, okay, how do we improve assurance? And then also how do we improve readiness, which goes a little bit to our workforce. All right, so after we have these technologies, the question has been, how do we better enable technology transfers? So I talked to someone today from a utility who pointed out that they've tried multiple times to commercialize something for a lab and it hasn't been very effective, partially because they just can't make it make sense from a company standpoint, right? It's basically, it's too expensive to implement. And there are lots of reasons, and we spent quite a bit of time going through what are those reasons and how have other people addressed them. And we identified 4 areas where we think this collaboration-based approach can help bridge this, what we call the technology valley of death, right? That can help get things from their early development stages, whether that's with a lab, with a university, or with the company, into, you know, being out there in the world. And the first is the technology showcases and demonstrations. So the goal here is to say, okay, we have a new technology, to show it to folks on this ecosystem that we've built and show, here's some of the advantages, disadvantages, what are the types of things you would like to see, again, in collaboration with our industry partners. You know, what are the questions that you want to ask that you don't have a facility to do this kind of testing in? The second is doing these industry researcher and supplier roundtables. So just getting people together to talk. A lot of what we found in the last year that we've been doing this is that people are not always having those conversations, whether because there's not a trust, there's not a connection, right? No one knows who to reach out to, or just simply no one has time to do the organization, right? That's most people, that's not the key description of their job. And so that kind of gets pushed down the list when other things come up. Another was doing these early engagement and feedback loops. So we talked about obviously working with Auburn. They have students who are interested here in doing sort of these customer listening sessions, we'll say, of, okay, we're going to do this research project. Let's go out and find out who is interested in this topic, what's already out there, doing a lot of that sort of groundwork and saying, okay, how do we solve the problem? And then as we move on, having them continue that engagement with those partners to say, here's how we can continue to improve it, making sure that we have the solution provider partners on board throughout this process is another big piece of this. As I referenced earlier, the labs don't tend to put out final products, and we almost never support them, definitely not if you're not government. And so how do we make sure that this gets into the hands of someone who can? And if we have problems like this isn't going to be financially viable, we know those early and either decide, okay, we need another way to get this out. And if it's promising, we need to start pursuing those approaches, or saying, okay, this isn't going to work. We just need to scrap this and focus on something else. And then the last is this technology validation program. And so a lot of that is how can we do these research prototypes and say, will they work in a real environment? And so that, again, is meant to be broadly available. From my perspective, I'm excited about that from the lab, being able to say, hey, we can deploy this in something that looks realistic. But the goal is to make that available to companies, et cetera. And then the last piece of this, as I talked about a little at the beginning, is the workforce. So we had a similar set of workshops and discussions with our industry partners on this. And what we found were sort of 4 things that they identified. One, they need employees who are skilled in IT and in OT, right? So they're, depending on who you talk to, and this was kind of a funny anecdote, is, if you talk to somebody who came from that OT world, who's probably an electrical engineer, and then had to learn some of the IT pieces on top of it, they'll tell you that that's the best way. They always hire the electrical engineers, and then they teach them what they need to know on the networking side. If you talk to people who came from an IT background, then they will tell you exactly the opposite. They'll be like, oh no, it's way easier to teach them the power piece that they need to know than it is to teach them all of the other cybersecurity and technology piece. So nobody can even agree on that. But what they can agree on is that we need people who know both of those things to do cybersecurity in this space. And that the challenge is those are very siloed right now, right? IT, if you kind of go even through computer science, right? You go through computer science, you don't see a lot of power systems equipment, probably none, unless you take a specific course in it. Cybersecurity, as people are offering cybersecurity curriculums, it's not necessarily focused on OT systems as well. And then we also have the internal split, which is very much around, does your IT security team talk to your OT team, and your OT team trust your IT team? Because they have a lot of, they need to exchange information and understand, for example, the cyber risk, but they need to do it in the context of operating a plant. Another thing we heard a lot is that students have no experience with the technology. They haven't gotten their hands on it. They've never seen it. Basically, when they come out of school, or basically through either a 4-year program or a 2-year program, they get to the utility, and then they just plan to train them for another year plus to do these rotations. It's a lot of resources. It means that you aren't getting people sort of in the loop very quickly. And as we need a lot more of these people, that becomes a bottleneck, and that's a problem. So how do we expose students to more of that? We heard a lot about non-technical and soft skills. So problem solving, critical thinking. And then we also heard certifications, and that we've sort of, as you can see, said doesn't really fall into CERC 3 and what we've been focused on. But I still put it on here in case anyone else is doing certifications and wants to think through that problem. But the things that we're doing here are a lot of focus on how do we expose students to these things. So we have 6 students right now who work on the project with us. From a variety of different fields, different majors, and that's intentional. So we have folks from the business school, we have computer science, we have electrical engineers, and the goal is to get them to work together on these kinds of things, so that, one, they know this field exists, because that was one thing we heard from a utility early on, is it would be really nice if people just realized this is the field they can go into. We do interesting stuff, and while yes, we have a lot of old things, we do have some new things, and it's got its own challenges, and it's not sort of one of the things we heard from someone else was, what do you do if it's all technology that's quote unquote dying? People see it as not a relevant way to advance their career. And so by having technology in the labs that is both a combination of sort of what currently exists and also new things that are coming, they see how that trajectory for their career. We're also working on obviously exposing them to the technology itself in that ecosystem. And then we're trying to weave into all of that these non-technical and soft skills, doing the problem solving. The students have been responsible for setting up a lot of the pieces in the lab, in so much as it sort of aligns with what their major is, but also being involved when it doesn't, and understanding all of the different pieces there. And so hopefully these things are all reminders, nothing revolutionary here, but things that have really stood out from this past year. One, trust is built by listening. So I remember early on when we started this program, James invited us to an industry meeting, and he said, these people just want you to listen to what they have to say and not have a solution for them. I said, okay, I can do that. And I think that was the other half, is someone vouching for you doesn't hurt, right? He had access to a lot of those communities already, and him saying, hey, you should have this person join, they're not a terrible person, was definitely a big piece of it as well. Using a shared language. So I touched on this with the IT OT boundary. I did actually have a phone call with a vendor, and I told that they were going through some of their things. And I said, well, we're in an OT environment, so that doesn't really apply. And they were like, we don't know what OT is. And so I explained, we talked about it a little bit. They're like, we don't know anything about that. That's a problem, right? When you end up in that boat, now they're not like, there's no chance of a sale, frankly, to someone who's in that space. And so having that shared language is important. It's also come up in very interesting ways as we're going through a lot of these different workshops. Is that, for example, we'll ask about, okay, so we came to the conclusion that alert fatigue is a problem. And they were like, no, alert fatigue is not a problem in OT. There's not that much stuff. But what we really need is like better alerting so that we don't have false positives, which to me says alert fatigue. But it's important that if that's not what, you know, they sort of think of it as, that's not the language we're using. And so that's come up multiple times. And then the last piece was really, we often, especially coming from the lab environment, see it as a, we need to have the technology solution. That's always what we're working toward. We found in a lot of cases that just facilitating the conversations was valuable. It didn't necessarily have to be us doing anything. The solution might already exist, and nobody knows it exists, or they don't know who to contact about it. And so being able to facilitate some of that has been maybe one of the biggest value adds that we've had so far. I hope that continues over the next couple of years, and that we're also able to move a little more into these spaces that I talked about. But that's a little bit of a summary about what our intro and first year has looked like, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, questions coming in. How will SCYTHE's mock utility operations centers and research labs emulate real-world cyber-physical attacks, and who will have access to that?
So the goal is to make access available as widely as possible. How we're going to specifically orchestrate that, we do not know yet, I'll be honest. So this year has been a lot of how do we build it? What does it look like? And getting it implemented, and less on the logistics of how are we going to sort of get people through determined time, et cetera. As far as emulating real world cyber physical attacks, well, one, we have talked to SCYTHE about this. So talking about how do we do that, the labs have experience in this. And so that's like one area where we've talked about, we may be able to say, okay, here's some additional things that rely on that, like operational technology expertise as well, and tie those in with existing tools. I think that answers that.
How can we as individual contributors or practitioners help? Is there a role for the community?
There is. So if you're in the Southeast, then please reach out. to me, or I can get you some contact information. And if you're not in the Southeast, still please reach out, because we'd be interested in talking. The goal when we set up this program was that if it's successful, it would expand to other regions in the country. And the whole idea behind the regional concept was not to be exclusionary, but really to say we can't maintain, we think relationships are the foundation of all of these other things, and we can't maintain relationships with everyone in the country at once. You're going to end up with either just a few people who are sort of making decisions for everyone, or you're going to just kind of have a one-way communication channel. So we're looking at how else we can sort of expand. And like I said, if you happen to be in the Southeast, please reach out for sure, because we can find a way for you to tie in.
What unique cybersecurity challenges in the Southeast, ergo hurricane-related disruptions, rural grid vulnerabilities, will CERC3 address that differ from other regions?
Yeah, so this is something we've also discussed as far as the regional challenge, right? Is that the Southeast is also growing very rapidly. So it's I think the fastest growth region in the country, which has its own challenges, right? Without any hurricanes or rural grid vulnerabilities. And so the way that we've been trying to address that right now has been in trying to make sure we represent as many of those like utilities that deal with these different challenges as possible, right? Because even within the Southeast, right, I say this, we need to split it into regions. Even regions is pretty big, right? Especially when we're talking about electric utilities. There are a lot of them. So how do we make sure that we get representative folks who are covering all of these different things? In Tennessee, we might see fewer hurricanes than, for example, in Florida. So making sure that we have both of those groups involved is important. Hopefully that answers the question for someone.
Does CERC3 plan to evaluate and provide suggestions for the cybersecurity skills gap? And what specific training programs or certifications, obviously certifications are a little bit out of scope, will it offer to students and professionals?
Yeah, so we have done some of that. I didn't go into details, but we have more detail than what I put on the slides. So happy to talk through that if someone wants more information. And we are looking at how to make sure those things get published as well, so this is more readily available. So yes, we're planning to do that. And then for specific training programs, right now we're working on how do we integrate this into Auburn's curriculum, basically as a pilot, because that's who we're working with. But the idea would be that we can move this curriculum elsewhere, that this would be available to others. We've talked about a lot of other options as well, as far as having a certification more in the university sense, where you could say, oh, I went through this program, but maybe this program of study, but I also did this sort of side program where I got exposed to what does this world of OT technology look like. So yes, we're not really looking at certifications in the way that they might be useful to utilities, but hopefully something from an education standpoint. The other piece is moving outside of the four-year colleges. So we have that on our roadmap, because obviously, while that may be our first focus, like utilities have worked with, I know Southern has worked a lot with their community colleges to make sure that they have the folks that they need for instrumentation and controls technicians.
Are you partnering with or reaching out to National Guard or State Guard organizations? So we've seen this in other states, like the Michigan has also a civilian auxiliary corps, which has kind of been the standard for the country. In this case, he's talking about Maryland with an active cyber component and the Army National Guard and Maryland Defense Force. So how is this region looking at those state and federal and military partnerships?
Yeah, so we have been working on that. That hasn't been a huge focus for this year, though it has been something we've talked about from a roadmap perspective, and we've sort of had initial conversations with folks. So Auburn is also partnering with the state of Alabama on sort of a different effort to do a lot of their emergency response, which puts them at a good nexus between the two programs. So we're working on that. I know we've sort of talked to some folks in Florida similarly about partnering with the state. We've been working with Savannah River National Lab, and they're very close to Fort Eisenhower. So being able to have some of those discussions. So we're working on it. I think right now there's not a lot, but we do recognize that like the defense critical energy infrastructure is going to be a big piece of this moving forward. And it's one of the things we're looking to expand on next year.
Okay, well, Tricia, thank you so much for joining us and sharing the CERC 3 program.
Of course. Thanks for having me.